So we're live. We're live. Dear speakers, turn your cameras on, please. And to our audience, all people who are listening, dear ladies and gentlemen, all over the world, as usual, good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. This is Claudio speaking, and this is number 7 in the series of our I-Core webinars. Let me quickly remind you what this is about. The I-Core is the International Consortium on Rehabilitation Robotics, aka the International Conference on Rehabilitation Robotics. We're a somewhat large community of passionate researchers, passionate about assistive and rehabilitation robotics, and all that comes with it. And let me also remind you that the biannual conference is going to start in now less than 2 weeks in gorgeous Chicago at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. I urge everybody to join us and interact. So, we're talking today about embodiment, one of these interesting phenomena that seem to arise when people are, how can I put it, tricked into believing that something external to their body is actually a part of their body. We'll have 3 talks by prominent colleagues in the field, and especially regarding embodiment this time. So let me introduce to you the guests that are going to be talking today. So Dr. Jonathan Schofield Dr. John Sensinger, let's go by the order of the talks. Dr. John Sensinger is currently the director of the Institute of Biomedical Engineering and professor of electrical engineering at the University of New Brunswick in Canada, trained as a biomedical engineer and as a clinical prosthetist, and licensed as a professional engineer in the province of New Brunswick. He's been working in Chicago and Thailand, and he's a co-founder of COAP LLC, the first company to successfully market pattern recognition in prosthetics. Past research by John has developed new mechatronic devices, including motor designs, cycloid gears, along with complete prosthetic systems. His current research focuses on multi-objective optimization of human-machine interfaces, with particular emphasis on prostheses and exoskeletons. He leads a team of faculty, scientists, engineers, clinicians, and students who all share a common goal of making an impact in the lives of others that extends from our neighborhoods to the international community. Dr. Sensinger is a generally curious person who values integrity, wonder, and future generations. Our second speaker, as far as the order is concerned, is Dr. Giacinto Barresi. Dr. Barresi, actually with a Master of Science and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and Neuroscience, so possibly the more exotic speaker today. He's a professor at the Bristol Robotics Laboratory at the University of West England in Bristol, in the United Kingdom. He works through the approaches of cognitive ergonomics and neuroergonomics on robotic digital enablers for biomedical technologies, meaning assistive, prosthetic, rehabilitation, surgical, virtual reality. He's a member of the executive committee of UK RAS Network for Robotics and Autonomous Systems, co-chair of the technical committee on human factors in robotics at the International Ergonomics Association, and the chair for telehealth telemedicine in the IEEE Telepresence Initiative. Previously, he was a researcher at the Italian Institute of Technology, Istituto Italiano di Tecnologia, located in Genoa, Italy, where he coordinated activities like the INECT project, funded by the Italian Multiple Sclerosis Foundation to develop assistive and rehabilitation devices. And he was also a scholar in residence at the Indian Institute of Technology in Gandhinagar, in India, and a guest lecturer at the Kyushu University in Fukuoka, in Japan. Last but absolutely not least, Dr. Jonathan Schofield, now the director of the Bionic Engineering Assistive Robotics Laboratory, called BEAR for short, and assistant professor at the University of California, Davis, in California, United States of America. He works to improve user acceptance and promote the seamless integration of humans and assistive medical devices, leveraging techniques in biorobotic control and feedback, sensory motor neural interfaces, and cognitive perceptual neurosciences. The BEAR laboratory performs interdisciplinary research at the interface of mechanical and electrical engineering, neurosciences and rehabilitation medicine to address unmet clinical needs and understand how humans engage with intelligent technologies. Dr. Schofield completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic's Lerner Research Institute. He completed his PhD in biomedical mechanical engineering and an MSc in biomedical structural engineering, both at the University of Alberta in Canada. So, I actually need to check that our live is working. Sorry, just a second. There seems to be, oh yes, it's working. It's working perfectly. Great. So without much further ado, I am going to give you liberally 10 to 15 minutes each, starting with John Sensinger. John, the floor is yours. And your microphone is muted, actually. So
there we go. Yeah, the screen disappeared, so I was looking for it. Thank you for that introduction, Claudio. Happy to be here. And we'll actually, towards the end of my presentation, challenge your positioning of the field a little bit, but I think that's partly what we're here to debate. Okay. So I'd like to situate myself as a researcher on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Wolastoqiyik. As a treaty people, it's important for us here in Turtle Island, also known as Canada and the US, to situate ourselves on the ground in which we live. So embodiment is a term that we toss around a lot in general. I see it more and more in popular media, but also in academia. And we all have slightly different meanings. And I suspect actually that the four of us on the call today have slightly different meanings, and I suspect the other speakers will give their own definitions as well. But I found it's good to start workshops like this with a general discussion of what we're talking about. And so most of my talk will be orienting us to at least a general field. And I think we probably all agree broadly on it, but there'll be some nuances in terms of where we go from that. So generally speaking, in popular literature, we can think of embodiment as a tangible or visible form of an idea. So you could say that the United States is embodied in the flag, and in terms of the UK, you could say it's embodied in the monarchy, perhaps, where there's this idea, this concept, but it has a physical presence. It has a physical thing that's attached to it. You can also say that embodiment is to give a body to a spirit. So in that sense, you could say that we are all already embodied, whether or not we have a prosthesis, where we have this physical body, and yet we think we are more than this body. We have intellect. We have something other than, more than the physical substrate that is us. You can talk about embodiment as being the experience of experiencing the world through your body and senses. This is somewhat of a Platonic expression where you're looking out of the cave and you're experiencing the world, and so you're thus embodying your body. And the definition that I will use throughout this presentation is the concept that you own and control a body and its parts. And so in that sense, it's not just when we have a prosthesis that we think about embodiment. It's actually us ourselves. We often, although we don't think about it much, I would suggest that most of us believe that we are embodied, that we own and control our own bodies and its parts. I've listed a couple good reviews here. There's many more out there, but these are fairly recent reviews. And so I've led a couple workshops in the past year or so on this topic, and I've realized that there is, as the title of this broad workshop suggested, a lot of controversy on this subject. Do we even care about embodiment? Is it something that we are only looking at because we've run out of other things to investigate in science, or because sensory feedback is no longer providing useful performance enhancements, and so now we're looking for fuzzier, softer things that we as scientists can, pay our attention to? And so I'd like to make the case in the next couple of slides that embodiment is actually something that's really fundamentally important in the field, but not necessarily related to performance. So I want to start on this track by saying I believe that embodiment is an emergent property. So it's not a fundamental property, but it's a property that emerges from subsystems. And at a broad level, humans like to remain alive. I think we can mostly agree on that. And in order to remain alive, we often strive to maintain homeostasis. We like our body to stay in states that are beneficial for its survival. We don't want to be too hot, like excessively too hot, or we'll die of heat exhaustion. We don't want to be too cold, or we'll die of hypothermia. We don't want to be dehydrated. Uh, we want to maintain homeostasis. And in order to do that, we need to be aware of where our body is in its state. And in order to do that, we often try to minimize surprise. So it's okay for us to go out on a snowy day as long as we know what we're going to expect and we've dressed appropriately. It's okay for us to go out in the heat as long as we brought a bottle of water with us. But we generally don't like to be surprised in a way that could threaten our very existence. And in order to avoid surprises, we need to have an accurate understanding of what is us versus what is not us, and what we can control versus what we can't control. Because if we think we can control something like the temperature of the sun, we're going to be in for a surprise that could threaten our very existence. On the other hand, if we don't think that we can control the amount of clothing that we wear or where we position ourselves relative to the sun, well, then we will also likely not survive for a very long time. So in this sense, I, I want to position embodiment as an emergent phenomenon that affects us all, that we all have, and that is primarily related to our survival. And so now I want to switch gears a little bit. I've been arguing for embodiment as something that we all have at least a bit of, and I want to talk clinically for a minute about why I think embodiment is important. So many of us in the field believe that uh, it's possible using various sensory feedback to make a person feel that the prosthesis is part of them in the same way that we feel that our arm is part of us. And I'm going to suggest that neither one of those is a trick, that our arm being part of us is just an emergent property called embodiment. And that if we can achieve that same emergent property in a prosthesis, it's not a trick, it's just the way we perceive our things. That's not necessarily yet a good or a bad thing, but stay with me for a minute. So if viewing parts of things makes us more likely to trust them, and there's evidence to suggest that when you have embodiment, you trust the parts of your body more, and that you forgive the parts of your body more than you forgive objects that are not part of your body. So if that's true, and if trust and forgiveness then makes you more likely to not abandon your prosthesis, if you forgive your prosthesis more in the same way that you forgive your own hand when your own hand drops a cup, if you forgive the prosthesis more, that makes you more likely to use it, as there's evidence to suggest. And if a prosthesis reduces long-term secondary overuse injuries, as there's substantial evidence to suggest, and I'll say that again, we've learned that if you do not use a prosthesis over long periods of time, you will use your contralateral limb excessively, and that you will then, as you get older, often damage that limb in this, in the same way that we all, when we overuse parts of our body, damage our body. So if that's the case, well, then embodiment is an important thing to achieve, looking at the long-term health and wellness of persons with an amputation, not necessarily for a performance enhancement, but because we're trying to reduce secondary overuse injuries. Now, in this slide, I've been very careful to list all of these as a series of if statements. And the reason I've done that is because while there's evidence to suggest that each one is true, no one has yet done a study starting from the beginning and demonstrating that embodiment links to a reduction in secondary overuse injuries. And that's because that would be like a 25, 30-year study. And we're just starting to achieve embodiment in prostheses in a meaningful way in the last 5 to 10 years. But I think there is evidence to suggest that this is true. Okay, so I quickly want to go over a couple of concepts. So there's a lot of sub-properties that are necessary in order to achieve embodiment, and I quickly want to go over those. And so I'm going to talk about actions and sensations, and I'm going to break apart actions into those that other people or other agents in the world control versus the ones that we control, and sensations in the world that are either co-located with our body, that are like present within our body schema, or those that are extended beyond our body schema. So internal representation is basically cause and effect. If I have a model in my head that hitting a baseball with a bat will make the baseball fly into the air. That's an internal representation. And it requires both an action. Some action has to happen. Either you have to hit the baseball or I have to hit the baseball. And there has to be some sort of feedback. I have to have visual feedback or auditory feedback. I have to see the ball move through the air or feel it when it hits me. Now, agency is when we are in control of those actions. So if I have control of my actions and I receive feedback showing that my actions are producing the feedback that I expect through my internal model, then we say that we have a sense of agency. And agency is an important concept because, as I'll show in a couple slides, it's one of the necessary components for embodiment. So if we don't have agency, if we don't feel that we have control over actions as relayed to feedback, then we're going to have trouble. So we need to have good control over prosthesis, for example. We also need to have sensory feedback confirming that our control is resulting in the actions that our internal model predicted would happen. Self-location is the concept that something belongs to our body space, and it requires integration of visual feedback with other sensory feedback. So if I see something and feel that that something happened, that is self-location. Tool incorporation is when we believe that something outside of our body belongs to us through sensory feedback. So a tennis racket is a great example of that, where I have sensory feedback and I can see what's happening, but it's outside of my body schema. It's outside of the space that I believe to be my own body space. And so I don't believe that it's part of my body, but it's still a useful concept. Extended physiological proprioception for those in the field is an example of this. In contrast, ownership is when our body belongs to us and it requires co-located visual and sensory feedback. So the feedback needs to be located within our body schema and again requires visual and other forms of feedback. We get embodiment when we own and control a body and its parts. So that means we need ownership and agency. Okay, wrapping up. There's a variety of ways that we can assess whether someone has both ownership and agency. And at least at the moment, we need to measure these independently from each other because they're both subproperties that result in the emerging property of ownership. Questionnaires are probably the most predominant way for both to measure them. And there's a fairly good questionnaire by Bredeker and Boudman that I'll refer you to that distinguishes between ownership and agency, which is important. There's other things. We've done work in cross-modal congruency. There's a variety of ways that you can measure it. Agency, there's questionnaires as well. Intentional binding seems to be preferred by many at the moment, most with a Libet clock, although some are doing work in psychophysics as well. And so I'll leave you with this thought that's come across in the last few workshops that I've presented on in this topic. And that is, it's really not a question of, have you embodied the prosthetic limb? Have you embodied the robotic limb? Have you embodied your own limb? It's really a question of how much have you embodied anything? How much have you embodied the prosthesis? How much have you embodied your own limb? It's not a digital on-off. There's degrees to which you can embody or even disembody your own limb, depending on the experiment that we do. And embodiment can be transitory. So we can create embodiment, but it can be a fragile state of embodiment that's easily lost once you leave the laboratory or once you do dynamic motions. And so understanding that embodiment can come and go with varying degrees of strength is an important concept. I'll leave it with that and turn it back over to Claudio.
That's just great. An excellent introduction, and more than an introduction, actually. Deep review of the field. Giacinto, I think you're up for the next one. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So you should see the presentation. I hope so. Okay. Can you see it?
We see it in the app mode versus presenter mode.
The presenter mode. Hold on.
The beauty of live broadcasting.
Now?
No,
It's
same.
still the PowerPoint app, actually.
The app. Okay. Luckily, we tested it a few minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly. About 5 minutes before starting, and still.
Now?
That's
yes, that works.
Okay. Thank you very much, Claudio, for the invitation and for the opportunity of speaking today. And surely the presentation of John already said almost everything. And now I will try to add something on a specific field I tried to care for in the last years, especially considering the digital synergies with the solutions for training, for stimulating the prosthetic embodiment. So, as already mentioned, I work at the Bristol Robotics Laboratory, and I'm participating into different communities, including the one of the Consumer Technology Society of the IEEE as industry liaison quite recently. And I moved to the Bristol Robotics Laboratory in the University of the West of England in 2024 in July, but I worked over 13 years at the Italian Institute of Technology on different types of biomedical robots. And mostly my duties were related to the human-centered design and the co-design of medical devices, of robotic medical devices in particular, for trying to match the user needs from the start of most of the projects I contributed to. And my specialty is the one of human factors and ergonomics, because I try to understand how people interact with other elements of a system for designing solutions that are improving the well-being of the user and the performance of the system as a whole. This approach is interdisciplinary, obviously. That's why my background in psychology and neuroscience is quite useful and helpful for understanding the human skills, limitations, and needs in real context in order to help the designers and the engineers to develop the technology, exactly like integrating the knowledge that could come also from disciplines like philosophy, anthropology, computer science, ethics, physiology, anthropometry, and so on. Specifically, my field is the area of the cognitive ergonomics. So instead of focusing mostly on the physical aspects like the biomechanics in physical ergonomics or the organizational aspect in the socio-technical systems, I focus on mental processes like perception, attention, learning, memory, decision-making, planning. And specifically, I try to employ the methodologies of neuroscience according to the framework on neuroergonomics, also exploiting most of the wearable devices that are already available for bringing the activity or research outside the laboratory. That's the main reason for using biosignals through this methodology. Anyway, why there is such an attention on the mind? Because even if we design for human minds, we should remember that these minds are moving human limbs. So we are optimized for being hunters and gatherers in the savannah, not for making microsurgery operations with a laser. Even if machine is bringing us inside the throat of a person, we should optimize the controls for what our hands are made to do, and our mind is controlling them. And we are not made for being cyborgs controlling artificial legs. While the previous work was made in the advanced robotics department, where I was working over 8 years in the IIT, this is one of the results of the works in the Rehab Technologies Lab in collaboration with the Prosthetic Center of Vinyl, exactly the one of the Hyperleg project. And overall, we should say that we should investigate how the human mind works for designing any kind of tools. And making experimental studies of cognitive psychology and neuroscience can inform ergonomics and engineering and design and human-centered design overall, even starting the works in laboratory first, in order to investigate how any potential paradigms of the interaction could affect and improve the control of this type of systems. So our selection in 2019 to focus on the embodiment in Rehab Technologies Lab was quite a winning move for me. It was quite a thrilling journey. As already said, the embodiment can be considered as sensing external objects as part of one's own body scheme, the neurocognitive representation of our own body. It's based on different sub-processes like the one of agency, feeling to be in charge, to be the author over an observed action, the ownership, perceiving to possess, to own a non-bodily object, and to recognize through the self-location that we are in the location where a certain object is. There was a paper, I think of 2016, of one of my professors in Padua, Mariella Pazzaglia, that was describing how this process can be triggered also by a wheelchair or any kind of assistive tool. the focus on prosthetics depends on the fact that obviously we are trying to integrate as much as we can an external limb, an artificial limb, for improving the quality of life of a person. And the co-occurrence of stimulations and events that we are observing according to our control can raise this event, can make this phenomenon emerge in order to improve the quality of life of the person, because typically we are studying in human factors, in ergonomics, the embodiment, because we want to increase the engagement of the person in the use of the technology in order to promote the acceptance of the technology itself. Why? Because most of the devices that are made as prosthesis sometimes can be disappointing for the users. If they're not immediately reliable and they're not controlled in a reliable way immediately, the person could abandon them, preferring cosmetic devices. So the embodiment, the investigation on the embodiment can become a strategy for trying to erase and to increase the technology acceptance and to motivate the person to use the technology. Otherwise, there will be no chance for the device to be tested deeply, for making the person able through the exercise to improve in the control of these systems. And one of the strategies for stimulating in laboratory the embodiment of an artificial limb, classically, is the paradigm of the rubber and illusion. In the rubber and illusion, typically the person is asked to see a fake limb while the real limb is hidden behind the panel in this case, and covering with the towel the arm of the person, and the artificial and the fake limb, the person is not perceiving the continuity between their body and the fake one. Meanwhile, the experimenter will start to stimulate physically, tactile level, the real hand of the person, while showing the contact between another object on the fake limb. The co-occurrence between the two events generates a visual haptic stimulation that is creating the multisensory integration required exactly for the phenomenon of the body ownership. And progressively, the person will feel the sensations in this case. In my opinion, this video is mostly an exaggeration for making people interested in this phenomenon, and it's okay to show it and to understand its value this way. But in the end, the person will start to feel, okay, the fake limb as the real one, and according to this exaggeration, also they can stop feeling the sensation on the real one. It's an exaggeration, okay, but the phenomenon of the disembodiment actually happens in several experimental studies. And the final way for demonstrating how powerful this stimulation can be is the hammer test, or making any type of harmful let's say event on the fake limb. The person will perceive it as happening on the real one. So another problem, another set of topics about the prosthetic embodiment is the one of the evaluation. There are several papers describing the metrics for evaluating it, for instance, considering just a subset, the sub-process of the ownership. As already said, the questionnaires are a solution. The behavioral tests, like the ones related to the rubber and illusion, like the proprioceptive drift, I will describe in the next slide. And the biosignals like galvanic skin response can work quite well for understanding how much the person is feeling, is sensing to possess, to own the object. And the proprioceptive drift specifically is based on the idea that the person should, by closing their eyes, should guess where the real limb is. And if they're pointing at the location that is closer to the fake limb after the stimulation based on the paradigm of the rubber and illusion, then we can assume that the fake limb was incorporated. Otherwise, if the person is pointing at the real limb, the illusion failed. So, as I said, I was investigating the prosthetic embodiment for trying to engage the person in the use of the technology. So it was like a way for stimulating a better alignment between the machine and the user. And the strategy we were trying to explore in Rehab Technologies Lab was the one of engaging the person in an embodiment training by using digital solutions based on augmented reality, specifically spatial augmented reality. Instead of asking the person to wear an augmented display, we are directly augmenting the surface in the surroundings by mimicking, for instance, through a monitor, the content of a box, and the person will see the digital replica of the prosthetic limb like inserted in this box. So it was like an augmented reality and illusion. And why we use this approach? Because why we design for human minds, we should remember that our minds learn typically through simulations like games, because we train ourselves through our instinct to play, because in the safety of a simulated condition, we can test activities and skills that will be useful in the real life. And on the other hand, this approach is quite powerful because it satisfies our need to feel competent, to feel autonomous, to be in charge of what's happening, and to feel in relationship with others. And I will explore these three aspects in some of the studies I conducted in the last years. Anyway, overall, the approach of using game-based stimulations is quite powerful because it's increasing the compliance of the person in following the procedure we are proposing. And our usage of digital systems was a way to take advantage of these characteristics of the human mind through interactive solutions like the gamified one. Okay, hold on. The first experiment was based on a biofeedback. The person was controlling their respiratory rate in order to summon the visualization of the digital replica of the prosthetic harness made by Rehab Technologies Lab and Centro Protesi INAIL. And we were asking the person to test the solution by breathing a certain pace. In one condition, the person was breathing slowly, like 6 breaths per minute. In another condition, normally, let's say around 12 breaths per minute. And why? Because when the person was able to summon through the biofeedback the digital replica of the prosthetic hand, they were feeling the contact of the ball that was cyclically touching the location where the digital hand was, and the person was feeling the contact of this ball like a vibration under their hand or their stump, because we also tested this system with a couple of prosthetic users, but most of the subjects were healthy people. And what we discovered was that the slow breathing condition that was devised exactly for triggering the slow cortical potentials in the brain through the stimulation of the axis between the breathing rate, the heart rate, and the brain waves, we were noticing that people were showing a proprioceptive drift towards the fake limb, the one on the screen, just in the slow breathing condition, while in the normal breathing condition, people were pointing at right, even overestimating, because apparently they were scared to touch the border of the screen. And in particular, there was a subject that I noticed that this is an anecdote, sorry if I always say that. A subject was laughing during the experiment, and I asked why, and he told me in the slow breathing condition that he wanted to scratch his nose with the hand on the screen. So it was quite powerful.
You have 2 minutes left.
Okay, okay. I will speed up. Thank you and sorry. In this other experiment, we replicated and extended the previous results, and we also demonstrated that it was possible to transfer the embodiment from the digital limb to the physical one, making a rubber hand illusion with the prosthetic hand harness afterwards. It was quite powerful just when, anyway, the person was able to build up the digital hand on the screen without ever losing the visibility. So it was a unidirectional biofeedback, we could say. We also tested virtual environments, and in this case, we discovered that making a dual task, engaging the person in terms of memory through the working memory, was detrimental for the embodiment. And this led us to the idea that probably we were stealing cognitive resources that specifically were used for creating the conditions for the embodiment. And this was confirmed in another experiment for the lower limbs, in this case, by asking the person to perform a social task by telling them to control through an EMG sensor the kicking activity of a fake limb on the screen that was mimicking the hyperleg device of Rehab Technologies Lab. We were noticing that a competitive or a cooperative, in another study, condition was ruining literally the proprioceptive drift, but it was increasing the number of kicks that the person was making. So it was creating a higher engagement. By alternating the two conditions when the person was disengaged in order to extend the duration of the training for the embodiment overall, we noticed that anyway, the cooperative and the competitive conditions were powering the sensation of the embodiment for the real prosthesis. So intertwining the two strategies was a winning approach. And summing up, these digital environments were able to help us to improve the sense of embodiment for during these studies, but also showing some properties of the embodiment processes, mostly related to the multisensory integration, in one case in terms of the effect of the physiological process like the breathing, and in the other about the competition for the same task-specific cognitive resources. So overall, the next study should focus, in my opinion, on developing low-cost digital systems for the prosthetic embodiment training during the user performance, instead of just observing the rubber and illusion. So the person should act. And thank you very much, and sorry if I extended too much the presentation.
It was anyway an extremely interesting presentation as well. So getting a little bit more in the technical, how can I say this, how you elicit the feeling of embodiment. Jonathan, I think last but not least, the floor is now yours.
All right. All right, perfect. Let me just screen share here. And does that look okay to you guys? You guys can see the screen?
Yes,
Yep,
we
looks
can.
great.
You might want to hide this hideous white thingy at the bottom.
There you go. How does that look, guys? That's good. Okay, so so perfect. Assuming you guys can hear me, just jump in if you can't. So what I would like to do is kind of take some of the definitions that were laid out earlier and exemplify them. What I'm going to do is describe some experiments that we've done in a prosthetic-like system and measure aspects of embodiment, which were agency, ownership, in a couple of different ways. We statistically modeled those aspects, and then we started to look at the relationships between these various components that we typically ascribe to characterize agency. And so some of the key citations here, the protocol that I'm talking about today was presented in an IEEE conference paper earlier, as well as there's a manuscript coming very soon here. So stay tuned. You should be able to dig into this and find the results very quickly. I wanted to first maybe motivate us. I know we all had our own flavor of motivation, but humans and assistive machines, we do have a bit of a complex relationship when we're cooperating with a technological partner. And I really think a great way to exemplify this is autocorrect. And so what I have here is a fun little example. So you see "Good night, Connor," "Au revoir, Carl," "gluten nacho." And then right away you can see Connor gets frustrated and says, "Oh, I meant gluten knock. I meant, good night in German." And you can see that it's capital letters. There's an exclamation point. And really, to sort of further exemplify the frustration, I actually pulled this from a Reddit feed called "Damn You Autocorrect." And I think this is really telling, because if we start to dig into what autocorrect can do for us, well, in reality, as of 2015, so things have only improved with large language models, etc., we were seeing autocorrect at about 95% accuracy. And kind of on the other side of the coin here, what we were seeing is users, as of about 2003, if you were using a touchscreen input device, about 1.8 input errors per string of text. And so in reality here, there's actually quite a bit of blame, perhaps, that can be spread around. But in reality, we also see things like "damn you autocorrect," and we like to yell at the technology, but I haven't actually seen that Reddit feed that's "damn you fat thumbs," or, kind of looking at maybe the human side of the errors that are being produced. So The reason that we do this is there's a very well-established, phenomena that we do as humans, which is called self-serving bias or error attribution bias. And what it is that we often like to blame other factors or other partners when our actions do not go according to plan, or if we have negative outcomes of our actions, we certainly like to displace disproportionate amounts of blame onto things beyond our control. And so this is true if you do poorly on an exam. I'm sure any of us that teach students, it's often the professor's fault if they did poorly on the exam or they didn't see those types of examples in the test or in the homework assignments. Competitive sports are this way. Failed relationships, partners often like to disproportionately blame the other partner when a relationship comes to an end, and so on and so on. There's so many aspects of just human life where we like to ascribe disproportionate amounts of blame to external factors. What's really important to notice, though, is that this is actually amplified when we start talking about assistive technologies. And often it's accompanied by negative emotional affects. So things like frustration often come along with it. And that means really important things because that can start to shape our propensity whether or not we're going to use and engage with an assistive technology or whether we're going to abandon or disuse that technology. So why does this all matter in terms of embodiment? And I think it's here that we actually have a really unique opportunity, especially in the assistive robotics space, the prosthetic space as well. What we're seeing is that maybe if we can start to engage some of those mechanisms that our brains are naturally using to recognize our own bodies or to recognize our actions as our own, if assistive technologies can start to engage those same mechanisms, we have an opportunity here maybe to start flipping our biases, to allow our relationships with assistive technologies to be a little more forgiving and a little more cooperative in nature. But as you start to dig through the literature, what you'll start to notice is that definitions are messy. There's a variety of fields involved, and these various fields use terminology and testing and measures in different ways. There's a whole slew of different measures available to measure things like agency or the sense of ownership, and it becomes very, difficult for us to kind of navigate this space. Certainly, I've felt this, and I know that many of us out in the community have been a little bit lost in just the depths and the sort of the variance in the way these various concepts are presented and measured. And so what we were hoping to do with this study that I'm going to talk about today is provide a little bit of clarity. What we did is we recruited 27 able-bodied individuals to operate a prosthetic-like system. And I'll talk a little bit more about the system in the next slide. But what we were trying to do is examine the relationship between the sense of agency and the sense of ownership. So that is being able to control the actions of a device as well as being able to believe a device is a part of the body. And what we hypothesized is that depending on how we measured these things, there would be quantifiable relationships among agency and ownership, and the measures themselves would likely have some sort of effect on the relationships that we found. So the system that we're using and just the general approach is we did this very active rubber hand illusion. And so what you see here is one of my grad students doing the experiment. His real arm is hidden underneath the table. This is a robotic hand. He is controlling it using a myoelectric pattern recognition system. So this is a myo armband. And so very similar to some of the types of systems you might see to control a prosthesis. On his fingertips are these coin cell motors. So much like what you might get in this sort of buzzing if you're doing a peripheral nerve stimulation system or some of the sensory feedback systems you might see in some of the more experimental prostheses out there, when the hand actually touches this box, he is going to get a buzz on his fingertips. And then what we had him do is, well, what we had all of our participants do is close the robotic hand. So basically, as they close their real hand, the robotic hand will close. And they're going to feel the buzz. And what they're going to do is when that hand touches, there's going to be an auditory tone. We want them to tell us what the delay between the hand closing on the box and that auditory tone was. So I'll show you what this looks like, and then we'll explain why we're doing all these things. One second. So hopefully you can hear this. Half a second, or like 3/10. So if you didn't hear that, it was basically the individual was closing the hand, there was a tone, and he was estimating how long the delay was between the hand closing on that box and the tone being played. What we were doing is actually manipulating a number of different parameters that are very classically ascribed to influencing the sense of ownership and the sense of agency. And so some of these things, very carefully and very systematically, we manipulated these parameters. But some of these things was the position of the hand. We've had a close, a middle, and a far position. We were also manipulating whether or not they were feeling vibration on their fingertips. We also had a condition where they were simply just watching the hand move as opposed to controlling the hand, as well as all the other conditions where they were actively controlling the hand. We very carefully blocked this into trials to make sure that a true sense of ownership or agency had enough time to form. In total, each participant saw 27 different combinations of close, middle, far, watching versus actively controlling, buzzing on the fingertips, etc. Each participant performed 127 trials. What we did is used a bunch of measures to capture the sense of agency and the sense of ownership. Some of these were very, very explicit measures, which are the very classic validated survey results for the sense of ownership and sense of agency. A couple examples of what those questions look like on the right-hand side. We also used intentional binding. So our participants were telling us how long they thought the delay between the hand closing on the box and the auditory tone was. And intentional binding would suggest that if they truly had formed a sense of agency over all the events, the hand closing and the tone in front of them, they would make smaller time interval estimates. Whereas if they felt that it was, out of control, or a sense of agency was not completely formed, they would typically overestimate or make longer time interval estimates. And so it's not about the accuracy of the estimate as much as it's the relative difference between smaller or larger would indicate a sense of agency being formed. At least this is how it's defined in very classic literature. And then finally, as we'd seen described earlier, we also measured proprioceptive drift, which is, again, very classically ascribed to the sense of ownership being formed. And that is, you ask the participant at certain time points to point to where they think their real hand is. And what you should see if there is, a sense of ownership formed, you would expect to see them starting to point closer and closer to the rubber hand. That drift away from their real hand is typically described as indicating a sense of ownership. So with all these measures being formed, please keep an eye out for the publication in the next handful of months here. There's going to be lots of really nice graphs, but what we did do is we ran some generalized linear mixed models or mixed effects models to look at the statistical relationships among all of our variables and our measures. And what we found is that the haptic buzzing had a significant effect both on the sense of agency and the sense of ownership when we used surveys. In other words, explicit measures of agency and ownership were sensitive to haptic feedback, the buzzing. And this is interesting because normally you see cutaneous feedback being associated with the sense of ownership, but we found that it also had an effect on the sense of agency. We also found that when we did our implicit measures, so this was intentional binding and proprioceptive drift, again, we found that haptic feedback had an effect on both of those. Again, you would expect proprioceptive drift, which is normally described as an ownership measure, you would expect it to be sensitive here to the buzzing, but the intentional binding was actually unique, and that's something that's not normally, the sense of agency and intentional binding are normally tied together in literature, and cutaneous feedback is not normally described as being a critical element there. Finally, what we found is that the prosthetic hand position, close, medium, or far, had a significant effect on both the survey results for sense of ownership and sense of agency. And again, this is interesting because agency in this case is typically not described as being affected by the position of the hand, whereas the sense of ownership absolutely would be diminishing as it moves further away. So again, we found that the relationships were not necessarily as clean as you would see when we were doing looking at classic literature where a physiological intact hand is being used. So this was all very interesting. I wanted to talk about the correlations real quick before I wrap up. What we found among our measures is, first of all, the survey results. The explicit measures of ownership and agency were the strongest correlations among all of our measures. In other words, the question is, are explicit ownership and agency surveys measuring truly distinct and perceptually unique phenomena, or are they actually maybe a little more correlated than we initially thought? So something to investigate there. We actually were really surprised to find that our intentional binding results and our agency survey results were not the strongest correlation. They were actually they were not as strongly correlated as we anticipated, certainly. And what this is interesting, the reason this is interesting is both of these measures are supposed to be picking at or indicating a sense of agency forming. And we found that this is not necessarily, this is certainly correlated, but not necessarily the strongest correlation among our measures. And then finally, this idea of proprioceptive drift, this was the one that surprised us the most. You can see that the amount of drift was not really correlated to much of anything. In fact, there was some pretty negative correlations there with the explicit sense of agency. But in reality, our results here seem to indicate that proprioceptive drift might be its own unique phenomena and maybe not as closely tied to the sense of ownership as previously thought. And so what I want to do is kind of wrap this up. I think that embodiment is a really important thing for us to be measuring. It holds the potential to be a powerful new dimension for assessment of modern prostheses. But I also think that prostheses and assistive robotics represent a very unique application of many of these measures. Many of the ways that we've chose to measure embodiment in the past relied on intact limbs that are, completely and tightly coupled to the human body. And now we're trying to do, things where we're offering a mechatronic replacement limb or an assistive device that's going to drive sensory motor compromised parts of the body. And this is a very different use case. And so I think it's very necessary for us as a community to take a step back and maybe revalidate and investigate the validity of some of these measures when applied to these very unique applications and these very unique types of technologies. This is definitely a meaningful endeavor, though, and this is the point I wanted to leave us off on, because I think if we really start to pick or to make headway in endowing some of these devices with the ability to be embodied, I think what we're starting to do is turn a corner, because not only are these devices offering a user additional function, but that function that they offer now become perceived as body function. And so we turn a corner here from feelings of dependence on an assistive machine to feelings of being independent and more capable with one's own body. And for me, anyway, I think that's really the crux of why we should be putting our time and our effort into diligently exploring how best to measure and evaluate embodiment in many of these assistive technologies. So with that, I want to say thank you so much, and I'm going to throw it back to Claudio here. Once I figure out.
That's great. Well, this is I think particularly interesting when you guys touch upon the issue of measuring ownership, agency, or embodiment, because they seem to be like fleeting phenomena, hard to pin down. So before I throw in one question and one provocation, I start with asking you if there's any reciprocal question. John, is there any question you want to ask to our colleagues? And or Giacinto and Jonathan? I think we can happily open up our microphones and freely talk.
Yeah, no, the only comment I'll make is, and this happens often in the webinars, is I think we mostly agree on the differentiation between embodiment, ownership, and agency, but I often see in people's talks that they're actually talking about agency or ownership, but they call it embodiment. And that happened a bit today. So I'll just give a plea to the broader community, but also the speakers here today, that if you're doing a study on ownership or on agency, to be careful and not broadening it out to the concept of embodiment, because particularly with the results that Jonathan Schofield has shown, it's still murky water linking the two concepts to embodiment.
The lower negative correlation really surprises me, right?
Yeah.
And BPD is possibly the very first, the early objective measure that was found by, I think this is Botvinnik and Cohen, 1998. I might be wrong here, but that's just around the time. So when the rubber hand illusion phenomena was made explicit.
Yeah.
I think it just really speaks to the fact that, in the experiments that we were using, I will fully admit that, you give someone a robotic hand and you're buzzing their fingertips, there's natural delays, there's things in there that do not represent the tight, sensory motor integration we have over an intact limb. And that's where a lot of this initial experimentation and our definitions and our measures are born and based out of. And so the thing that I've been trying to hit with these various workshops that we've been a part of is that I think we really do need to do our diligence. If it's a unique technology and there's not a deep wealth of literature for us to draw upon, I think we have to do our diligence to make sure that the measures we're picking are truly either representative or they are, capturing the various phenomena in the ways we might expect. So validation is an important piece, and that's my plea to the community. Let's be better and make sure that we're very diligent in the way we're applying our techniques and our measures.
Probably such measures should also be considered in ecologically valid context. So when a context is similar to the real life. Because I remember that one of the proposals were advanced by someone in literature, I don't remember the name, was to test if the person is using the hand for greeting people, which is quite interesting because it's a spontaneous activity made with the hand for communication. So if we use ethnographic approaches like the one of the video analysis in qualitative research, we can observe and we can count how many times the person is doing such an activity. But there are also studies, one of Imaizumi of 2016, where they were analyzing the sway in the posture and the walking and the gait of the person that was wearing a prosthetic arm. And they were noticing that if the embodiment of the prosthetic hand was high, the posture and the gait of the person was more regular. While in the case of a person with a less embodied prosthetic arm, the center of mass was moving towards the contralateral side, which is quite interesting because typically we could think that a prosthetic leg could affect the gait or the posture, but in this case, the presence of something that is not perceived as part of the body is altering the behavior of the body as a whole, and this can be quantified.
I remember plenary talk by Hugh Herr, possibly last year in Heidelberg at the BIROB conference. At some point, he said the best confirmation that my system was working was this. I think it was a lady. So this woman sitting, crossing her legs with the prosthetic leg, and she started wiggling her ankle like we all do when we're listening to something. But then ecological validity. I mean, good luck with measuring proprioceptive drift while I'm manipulating stuff in a kitchen. This is getting even harder than expected. I do have a couple of questions through the YouTube chat. Well, one is by Rui Lorero. So that's a very interesting question. What does one embody? A limb, I guess a robotic limb, or a task? Does anyone have any answer to this? Because I have no clue here.
Yes. So I would say that you embody the limb, not the task, but that depending on the modalities of feedback that we are providing, it is easier to maintain embodiment in some tasks than others. And that as humans, if the tasks in which we can embody the limb are few in number or static in nature, that we don't really feel a concept of embodiment, or that embodiment is a fragile concept. So does that make sense? You embody the limb, but the ability to embody a limb depends on the task. So if I undergo the rubber hand illusion, that is a task that I can undergo that can disembody my own limb. It's still my limb that's embodied or disembodied, but the task can create the embodiment or disembodiment of my limb.
That's a very interesting note, actually. I might even say, so in the case of prosthetics, that probably depends on how good our control is, right? So how well can the amputee or even an exoskeleton user or whatever, so have the device move according to his or her own intent. I guess there might be some correlation there. We do have a study about embodiment a few years ago out, and we tried to provide better or worse myocontrol systems, but that did not influence so much the amount of PPD. It gave slightly better result with these the questionnaires, actually.
And Steve, you're talking about ownership, but the control's linked to agency, right? And so this is why, as a field, we have to distinguish: are our studies talking about agency, in which control is relevant, or ownership, in which case control is not relevant, but sensory feedback co-located with vision is relevant.
Okay. Can we broadly say, and this is like a gonzo question, I really don't know. Can we say that ownership has more to do with feedback and agency with feed forward with control, or are the two things inextricably
Yeah,
intertwined?
they both involve feedback, but agency necessitates control, whereas ownership doesn't necessarily require control, but may be potentiated by control. So it gets messy, but at a core level, you need control in order to have agency. You don't need control in order to have ownership, as seen by the rubber hand illusion.
Exactly. So I was just about to ask. So probably both Winnick and Cohen were measuring agency rather than embodiment.
With the rubber hand illusion, they were measuring ownership, not agency.
Ownership, sorry, not agency, because the rubber hand
That's
cannot
right.
move according to
That's right.
what the side. Yeah, exactly. That's very interesting. This also, I had taken a note while you guys were talking that one of the most remarkable things about the RHI, and I have trouble explaining this to my student, first year master students, is that phenomenon seemed to be really quantitatively assessed. Meaning, I remember a graph in which there was some linear fitting between the time inside the experiment and the amount of PPD recorded. But then also that seems to point to the fact that PPD is probably a better measure of ownership, not of agency.
It's a measure of ownership.
Okay.
And try to consider that the robotic hand illusion, is a totally different story, because in that case there is a certain degree of control, because the person should open and close the hand, because there is a control of a robotic limb. So it can generate the agency. And among the items of the questionnaire for the ownership, there are there is at least one where people is asked to say if they feel to control the fake limb, even the rubber hand that cannot be controlled. But that's a kind of item that is used typically to understand on one side the potential effect of the ownership of on the agency, but also to understand if the person is faking the responses.
Okay, so it's like a negative
exactly.
confirmation question.
It's one of the questions that are made for avoiding to discriminate if the person is actually reading what they're answering to.
I see. That's very interesting. So that's exactly. So this is how I feel that we should go about. So like trying to find discriminating way of measuring the three different items. So owner, agency, and embodiment. I have two questions, or maybe it's one full question from Eric Early from the YouTube chat. So I'm just reading. Infants and children, this is constructivist, I love it. Infants and children take many years to learn to control their limbs. And one could argue that control and agency are quite poor for a while. How do prostheses use time and practice? So how do prostheses use time and practice feed into embodiment?
I think these are really important questions. And so interestingly, we are actively looking at some of these phenomena to be published soon in children, both children that have lost a limb later in life and children that have been born missing a limb. And you know, the idea here is that, yeah, absolutely, it takes time. This is, you know, I would suggest that many of the experiments that are out there that are using embodiment measures focused on prostheses are, and ours is the same way, right? You sit down a person, they are there for, you know, an hour, maybe two, and then they go away. And there's that training aspect is not there. But I anecdotally would highly suggest that as you learn and you develop these internal models in which your actions and the prosthesis moves and you understand and expect feedback, I think that sort of development and that sort of, you know, intimacy that you learn and grow into with your prosthesis is really important to further embodying it. I would be very surprised if we were to do a long-term study and see that embodiment is static. You throw the arm on and it's there,
Right.
or it's not.
We need, unfortunately, to say goodbye to John, and for a very good reason, actually, because I-Core is happening in 2 weeks. So the conference-related duties, I believe. Thank you very much, John.
That's
That
right.
was a
Yep.
pleasure
Thank you
to
for
have
inviting
you.
me. This was very fun. Yep.
Yeah, great.
I
Goodbye.
hope the discussion goes well. Thank you.
So I think we might use a couple minutes more. There's a follow-up to the question by Eric. He's asking, and is it reasonable to expect immediate embodiment of a prosthesis? How can we help people get over the hurdle of poor control to the point where their control allows embodiment to emerge? This is a really good one. Yes, I believe the answer to the question is rhetorically, no, of course, no. So you can't have immediate embodiment.
Let's say that probably depends on the feedback. If you are able to establish control feedback compatibility immediately, let's say in a matter of minutes, probably the person will start to keep exploring. And instead of triggering the embodiment, we would trigger the enactment, actually, because the person would start to use the prosthetic limb and to test it and to use it also for perceiving the surroundings. Having perceptual feedback is fundamental for making the person feel that something is happening under their control. So if the perception provided through stimulators on the stump, for instance, that are creating the feeling that the person is touching something, is like creating the motivational drive for doing more and more with that limb. So the feedback, the perceptual feedback is fundamental, probably is the key for creating not maybe an immediate embodiment, but quite a quick one.
Even more than accurate control, you're claiming.
Let's say that we are not feeling that something is happening, the control is fine, but is similar to the one of the tennis racket or another type of tool.
When I a few times in my life I woke up in the dead of night and I couldn't feel my left arm anymore, probably because I had been sleeping with my weight over the brachial plexus. And that's a really weird feeling. It's like, I mean, you see that the arm moves, but you have no idea what you're doing, so you have to look at it, right? I think this is related to that.
There are a series of lectures of Professor Ellison Okamura that are discussing initially there online in the website of Harvard how the lack of haptic sense is totally disrupting the control of a limb. So they are together, and it's interesting that haptic is referred to interaction. It's an inactive perceptual channel because it's working in both directions. It's not working just in one, like the hearing, for instance, for listening. The eyes work in one direction apparently, but you can also use them for communicating to others our mood. But the haptic dimension is bidirectional.
This is fascinating. I was a couple of days ago, I was at a workshop of philosophy organized by the Department of Philosophy here at Erlangen. And one of the researchers was all about the way that perceptual objects, as they call them, are actually built and they sort of incorporate action because they change according to the way you approach them. And according to the way, so based on the way you sort of explore the world. I fully believe that's the case. And as a sort of a surprise to see that there seems to be a part of philosophers in that field that consider that perception is almost a passive. So building your perceptual objects sounds like passive. I really cannot imagine that that's the case. And this relates back to Eric's question before. So when babies are getting proficient in sensory motor coordination, I mean, that's exactly it.
Yeah, I think the other important part to mention to, or response to Eric's question as well is that embodiment is not, as John Sensinger had pointed out, it's not a binary thing. It's either there or it's not. And, it takes time and training. Certainly it improves, but with a prosthesis, I would suggest it would improve. But yeah, I think that's the other thing. It's there's a tolerance. And I think that to his question, if you're getting the right sensory feedback, that sort of combined sense of embodiment will allow you to be a little more forgiving if control is maybe suboptimal, or vice versa, right? Like, it is a feed forward and a feedback phenomena. You need both those components to build it. So yeah, just to sort of pile on, I think that there's a few responses there that are kind of relevant to this question.
I don't want to cite myself too much, but since I'm the moderator, I had a paper a few years ago in which a psychologist and I claimed the task of myocontrol, and we didn't talk about feedback, but say myocontrol plus feedback, is not to enable control of a prosthesis. It's to enable rebuilding action schemes in Piagetian language. So when you have a motor impairment, it can be stroke, it can be SCI, it can be amputation. Some of these, a lot of these action schemes that you built when you were a baby gets broken, right? They're disrupted. And then what we should aim for is to rebuild those action schemes, which would bring you back to the function you had before and would definitely promote embodiment. Let me conclude with a provocative remark and see if you can bear it. Is this acquaintance of mine, actually almost a friend, who's living in Switzerland, Wolf? He once told us, "Why are you seeking after embodiment? If I embody my prosthesis and the prosthesis breaks down, I'm gonna suffer a lot, so I don't want to embody my prosthesis." Now, what's your comments about that?
I'm willing to jump in. I mean, that's just such a, a glass half empty type of approach to it, right? Like, yeah, certainly prostheses break down, and we have to, deal with, I mean, they break down far too much in many cases. But I mean, I think that what we're talking about, maybe glass half full here, what we're trying to pursue is turning that corner from I've strapped a machine to me to I am more capable with my body. And I know this isn't answering your question, Claudio, but the reality is, I think that the goal, the road bumps along the way to getting to that goal are probably worth pursuing. And yes, absolutely, if you're truly embodied and it breaks down, that's going to be devastating. But I don't know. As a researcher and as a scientist that's working towards this embodiment goal, I kind of try not to think about the horrible side of that, as opposed to where we're going and what we're learning along the way is totally worth pursuing it. So not a direct answer, and probably not a great answer, but that's how I sleep at night, I guess.
Jacinto, a final comment.
This is probably a value-sensitive topic, and the value-sensitive design would tell us that we should make investigations, and conceptual one for understanding what's the definition of the subjective experience, the negative one, empirical ones for testing how people feel, and technical ones for understanding how to make indestructible prosthesis. Because even if my car could break, I will suffer for sure if I use it, and if my salary depends on the fact that I need to go to work. So obviously, the suffering for a limb, an artificial one that I'm using every day, could break is different because it's visceral. But try also to understand that there are value-sensitive design studies in prosthetics about the idea to insert the painful stimulations in a prosthesis, the nociception. Is it right, or is it wrong to provide a person with a negative?
Good luck with your ethical committee. Good luck with your ethical committee about that. Anyway,
it's a challenge. We should try to develop them in any case.
I do believe that we're still years away from that, because in order to achieve full embodiment, you really have to have a excellent control and excellent feedback. I guess the technology is still not there yet, not yet there. Still, let me remind you, Wolf's prosthetic test. He asked once, so he claims that he asked once one of the people who were examining him. So Wolf has right-hand side distal transradial amputation. And he asked, okay, to this researcher, "You're so sure of your system, use the prosthesis to grab a cup of boiling coffee and hover it over your laptop." He says no one's ever accepted the challenge so far. And I can understand why. Any further, so I don't have any further questions from the YouTube chat. Any final comments from you guys, or we just close it here?
I just want to say thank you. This has been really enjoyable. Thank you.
Brilliant webinar. One of my favorites. Well, all of them are my favorites, of course. So thank you very much for being our guests. Thank you for all the live watching people, and thank you for watching offline. I will ask you then to send me your slides per mail so we can put them usually in a repository which will be accessible through the YouTube channel. And well, see you soon for the webinar number 8 in about 2 months, and the topic is to be announced. Thank you very much, and see you all at ICO Rehab Week in 2 weeks in Chicago. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.